What we're hoping to do is give some tips today because you are the front lines. You're the ones that are guarding the border for your association. You're the ones that are making the tough calls. People look to you to say, how do you protect us long term? And some of these things are, how do you protect me not next week? How do you protect me 30 years from now when I have to replace a roof, when I have to replace another major component? So there's two folks that you're going to hear from today. Me, and by trade an attorney representing associations. I'll talk about some of the legal aspects, and then you are in for a treat. Buckle up, because you get to hear from Jim Talaga, who is going to tell you, as the kind of one of the preeminent reserve study people in the Northwest. He'll give you practical advice, and that's what we hope to do. We hope you walk out of here with practical advice. So when we come to the legal issues, we'll throw some slides on there, but let's just pause. Let's just read the statute together, see what it says. And we're hoping that what you get from this is you put a couple flags in the sand. You may not recall exactly what to do in a particular instance, but we're hoping what you remember is that's an issue, and it might be an issue that you give Jim a call on or another reserve consultant on CAI's list. Might be an issue that you call an attorney, and any of the attorneys that are on CAI's directory would be fantastic to call and very knowledgeable. Well, let me ask Jim if you would come up here and speak to us. Protect our borders.
Okay. Good morning. Gosh, you're a tough act to follow. I drove here from Maple Valley. So anyway, very happy to have Bob here and all of you today. And it is a first morning session, so how about some calisthenics? How many people own in a community association, condo or homeowners association? And my hand's up because I do too. How many people, then raise your other arm if you work in the community association industry? All right. How many people, keep your hands up if you completely understand your association's governing documents? Okay. Take note of the people with the hands up because we might need to bring you up here a little bit later. So today's class is Reserve Study Beyond the Basics and then decoding your governing documents. So before we can get beyond the basics, let's revisit a little of the basics. And let's get to work. So what a reserve study is, it's a planning tool and a disclosure document for owners, buyers, and others addressing the most significant maintenance, repair, and replacement expenses an association's likely to face over time. It works hand in hand with your operating and maintenance budget. And there's 3 expected results from a reserve study. Number 1 is a component list, what you're reserving for. Number 2 is a measurement of current reserve fund strength. And lastly is a plan, recommended contributions to offset future expenses. Pretty simple. Within the reserve studies, there are some key terms, and these have some confusion, and so we want to clear these up this morning. As we go beyond the basics, here's where we start. The first thing is the fully funded balance. Let's talk about what that is. You'll see that in every reserve study, and it's one of the required elements. And it's the reserve balance that is in direct proportion to the fraction of life that's used up of the current maintenance, repair, or replacement costs. So let's make a simple example out of that one. Let's say that you've got a project that's $100,000 and you do it every 10 years. If you get to year 5, what's your fully funded balance? $50,000, absolutely correct. Synonymous term with that is 100% funded. So that's important to realize those two things go together, 100% and fully funded. So if you get to year 5 and there's only $25,000, you're 50% funded. Okay, everybody's with that one? Where it gets complex is when we have components sometimes in the hundreds and they're at different intervals, every 5 years, every 10 years, every 6. So the next thing is percent funded, and that's a measurement of your reserve fund strength that is standard in this industry. So the percent fund is the ratio at a particular point in time of your actual reserve balance to the fully funded balance, expressed as a percentage. So with that same example, in year 5 of that $100,000 project, if, again, you're at $25,000, you're at 50% funded, and so on. And now why is that important? Because it's a measurement really for your risk. And this type of planning is all about risk. It's what you're willing to put your members at risk for a special assessment or surprises. And in the 0 to 30% funded range, you've got a high probability that you're going to have a special assessment. And those are tough on communities in a lot of different ways. So a simple takeaway here is the lower the percent funded, the higher at risk your association is. Some more terms, fully funding contribution. So we just talked about fully funded balance. What's a full funding contribution? And that's the dollar amount. Here's where we get to the plan part. The dollar amount of reserve contributions necessary, and it's typically expressed monthly in a reserve study, to achieve 100% full funding. And here's key right here, at the end of the 30-year study period. In 25 years, this coming year will be our 25th year in business, and another milestone of 25,000 reserve studies. We're pretty proud of that. And we've never told anybody in those 25 years, if you're at 20% funded, get to 100% tomorrow. So a typical plan in a reserve study is a gradual climb, a path of ascendancy towards lower risk and stronger reserves. To contrast that, the baseline funding contribution is the dollar amount necessary simply to maintain reserves above $0 at any point throughout the study. And the threshold is something in between. It's chosen by you or the policy of your board, a dollar amount necessary to achieve a stated objective other than fuller baseline. 60%. Did anybody catch when FHA had a policy in place for a time that existing condos needed to be 60% funded? That would be a threshold target. Or it might be something like, we don't want to ever see our reserves go below $100,000. Something like that, but it's a stated objective. And here's a typical executive summary in a reserve study. It's going to show you some key things, and this is probably the most important page in any reserve study. And that's the starting reserve balance in this particular association, $5,600. That fully funded balance, if they're setting aside the appropriate used up fraction of all the stuff they have to take care of, $38,000. Now the next line shows you on a per unit basis whether that's a deficit or a surplus. In this case, it's a deficit. They have $5,600 in the bank. Ideally, to be 100% funded, they would have $38,891. So this per unit deficit, this is a statutory requirement in the state of California, and it's kind of where we're headed with this type of planning so that buyers and owners have an idea, a point of comparison. If you were to go out in the market and look at two different condominiums that were in every way identical except for the fact maybe that one had strong reserves and one didn't, this is a way to kind of focus in on what it means in a per unit basis. So that's included, that's why we include that in our report, and it's required in California. So $5,600 in the bank, $38,891 is ideal. The next line, the percent funded, shows 14.4%. So everybody looked at that little thermometer. Is that good, fair, poor? Poor. It's a high-risk association. Now let's stop for a second, though, and percent funded is one measurement, and it tells you part of the story. And what we want you to, it's like any budget, the reserve study, it's about money coming in and money going out. So you have to look a little deeper to truly understand the cash flow needs, and you'll see it throughout a reserve study where your big expenses are going to be. So let's take this example, a 14.4% funded association, and let's say that we have two different communities. They're both 14%. One of them is 25 years old. Next year, they have to replace their roof. One of them is 2 years old, and they've got half a dozen years until their next major expense. Are they both in the same poor condition? They're not, okay? So that's something to be mindful of. It's one measurement, it's one that we use a lot in this industry, and it is telling, but if you've got a younger association and more length to your next expense, then you've got the benefit of time to increase those reserves. So next, then, here comes the plans. What's it going to take? The fully funded contribution rate monthly, in this case, $9,120, to get to 70% target at the end of that 30-year study period, $8,380. And this might surprise a lot of people. Baseline, just to keep it above zero, $8,040. So there's been a lot of confusion about these two, and a lot of our industry people too talk about, well, you don't want fully funded, you want something other, baseline, and not realizing that there is not that big of a gap between the two of them. And if you look below, you can see that this current association contribution rate is $1,550 a month. So they've got a ways to go, right? But how fast they need to get there really depends on when that expense is coming. They're getting a whopping 0.1% of interest rate of return and annual inflation of 3%. So to illustrate this a little further, the difference between full funding and baseline funding in the over 24,000 reserve studies we've done, the data shows that the difference on average is 13% between what it takes to get to fully funded or just to maintain your reserves above zero. So the difference is in per unit, and this is a very typical monthly reserve contribution rate per unit. If it's $75 a month per unit just to maintain above zero, it's $84.75 to get up to full funding. So you're talking less than $10 a month, okay? But when you know this information, this is where it starts empowering you, okay? We start removing some of this emotion. We're putting together a business plan. One of the things that I do in the community association industry is I'm on the Legislative Action Committee, and the law came into play in 2008, which we're going to talk about today. I'm very excited about that, to require reserve studies, and we're going to propose in 2011 some cleanup work, and one of those things is to require that both of those decision points be shown in the study. Makes sense, right? Okay. What a reserve study does is it communicates the financial needs outside of the operating and maintenance budget. Typically, it's a line item on your operating budget, usually one of the very last ones, to reserves. The reserve study should substantiate what you're putting aside in this savings account that we call reserves. And it provides the community a vehicle to be proactive versus reactive to the maintenance, repair, and replacement. So when you've got a good idea of when your projects are going to occur, it allows you to prepare in advance, to solicit several estimates, to get a proper scope of work put together, and it puts the association in control. And when you know your cash flow, you can employ investment strategies to maximize returns. We were all taught the power of compounding interest, and it works that way on reserves too. I don't have a slide on this, but I want to interject one thing. We did a study. It was a component of a 15-year roof, a roof with a 15-year life, and we compared the couple different ways to pay for this roof. One of them was setting aside ongoing reserve contributions, saving for it, and allowing that to accrue interest over time. The other is a special assessment, and so if we have a $250,000 roof with a 15-year life, the special assessment is what? $250,000, right? Those owners at that time would be special assessed for $250,000. A third way would be to take a bank loan, and with typical bank interest rates and amortizations, that roof would cost approximately $338,000. But if you were to save over time, that $250,000 roof, because of the compounding interest, would be $198,000. So the least expensive of the three ways to do it. What it does, continuing your reserve study, it removes the guesswork and emotion. Well, some of the emotion. There's always going to be emotion in associations. And you can use it to overcome objections, induce volunteerism. I like this. I recall one time at an annual meeting in the basement of a church, and we needed divine intervention that night, Bob, because it was a huge special assessment, and I was the guy delivering the news. And when the news was delivered and all of the angst showed up in the room, I pulled out a pad and I said, "We'd love to have your input." When one guy said, "Well, my brother Joe can replace the roof at half that price," I said, "Well, great. If Joe is licensed and bonded and has experience with condominiums and has the proper insurance, it'd be great to talk to him. Wouldn't you love to be on a committee?" And we signed up a dozen committee members. We turned that negative into a positive and got people involved. And that's a key to your communities, is keeping people involved. So put a good committee structure together too. And the reserve study provides you a means to track the financial condition as you go each year when you monitor it carefully. You don't do it and set this aside. It's like any part of your budget process, and it's significant. The typical reserve contribution should be 20 to 40% of your budget. What a reserve study is not, it's not a forensic examination. It's not a review of code compliance, a structural analysis, and it's limited to exterior observations and research. So what your reserve study provider won't do is come and take your building apart, analyze nailing patterns, look at the stuff underneath. And as we've come to learn in the Seattle area, that can have a profound impact on the overall viability and health of your building. So it's important to work that discipline, that separate discipline, as part of your team in the care of your association too. And sometimes and often, the reserve study recommends further studies such as building envelope investigation, roof consultation, and various engineering studies. And it's not discovery and documentation of construction defects, something that Bob knows well about. And now we get to the law, the fun part. So I'm excited about this. I'm real comfortable with reserve studies, but the law is something that I kind of squirm a little bit over, so I'm super happy to have Bob here. And we're going to work in tandem and start talking about reserve study statutes and how that implicates the whole process.
Fantastic. Well, let's talk law. Fortunately, the law on reserve studies is about this thick. There's just nothing there. So we can run through it relatively quickly. And then what we want to do is think about some of these principles that we're going to talk about is these fantastic guardrails. And like we were saying at the beginning, you're just planting flags in the sand. You're just saying, I think that's an issue. I think Bob talked about that. And that by issue spotting, hopefully we're going to find our way out. Can you click the next slide up there? So wouldn't you, how many times have you seen a law that talks about somebody's being encouraged? Almost like law and encourage ought to be in different worlds. The law encourages us to set up a reserve account, but does that mean we need to? If the law says you're encouraged to set up a reserve account, must you set one up? No, you're just encouraged. I encourage you to be kind and generous and wonderful and all that, and don't cause Blackhawks to go out. So you can encourage somebody, but now what's the standard though? The standard of care for you as fiduciaries of the association is good faith and using your good business judgment. And so let's pause for just a moment and talk about the business judgment rule. For those of you that have volunteered to serve on the board, for those of you that are serving in management professionally for associations, this business judgment rule is a huge safe harbor. So would you please just write down somewhere on a scrap of paper, business judgment rule. That's the Switzerland of everything that you do. It's this safe zone. The business judgment rule essentially says this: if you make a business judgment, and if it's an accounting question, talk to a CPA. If it's a legal question, talk to a lawyer. Does that mean like every decision you make, do you have to consult someone else? No. But if you consult another advisor, you consider that, and then you make a decision that isn't influenced by an undisclosed bias or like, your cousin is really the one that's doing the work and you haven't disclosed that to the other board members. But if you make a reasonable business judgment based on consultations with others, then you're protected from liability. Isn't that fantastic? Don't you want that? I want that in my Christmas stocking. You're just protected. Does that mean you'll never get sued? No, but it gives you a defense. The defense is the business judgment rule. How are we going to document the business judgment? How are we going to show the corporate memory for this nonprofit association? What are we going to use? Not hours, minutes. There's the answer. So when you're making your decisions about reserves, about all the things, putting into practice what Jim's been talking about, we want to record it in the minutes. But pausing there for a moment, do we want to record what goes on, like with the tape recorder, or any of you with a high school kid have GarageBand? You want to press record at that board minute? No. No, you don't want to do. The minutes are the official acts of the association. So a motion was made. These are some of the factors considered, and it was seconded. These are the folks that voted pro, these are the folks con, and it passed. Does that make sense? You want to document, leave a trail of breadcrumbs for what you decide when you get information from Jim, when you get information from other consultants, because what's our notes say on that scrap? What's Switzerland? Business judgment rule. It's your friend. And the way we get there is by documenting what you did. So, starting with the beginning of the reserve study statute, it says you're encouraged to set up a reserve account. If you decide not to, what do you want to do? Document it. Just say, this is why. I think it's a pretty good idea to set one up. Do the next thing, which is then use your business judgment to decide and even use those words in your minutes. Doesn't that sound like a safe harbor? In our business judgment, we decided to do this. So the first thing we're supposed to do is set up a reserve account if you like. This applies, as Jim was saying, to both Old Act and New Act condominiums. So all condominiums, does not apply to homeowners associations. Would it still be a good idea for major components? You bet it'd be a great idea. Here's the out though. We're supposed to do this unless doing so would impose an unreasonable hardship on the association. We're supposed to prepare a reserve study. So the next thing the statute says, prepare a reserve study unless it would be an unreasonable hardship. What's an unreasonable hardship? How hard's hard? Right? So what are we going to do? Document it. Oh, what else are we going to do? Talk to him. Well, aren't we going to find out from people? Wouldn't we talk to an accountant and say, well, how difficult will this be? How expensive will it be to do a reserve study? Now, the law goes on to say that in the first year, you'll do this reserve study based on a visual inspection. So you can't have somebody just in an office building say, you know, fill in the box here. It's 20 units. It's got an asphalt roof, and so here's in the mail your reserve study. So the first year it needs to be on a visual inspection. Most of you are beyond that because you're over a year old, and you're on this 3-year cycle. And the idea is that beyond every 3 years, you need to update that reserve study based on a visual inspection. You need to have somebody, a reserve consultant, come and take a visual look. But it goes on more, and it says that each year you need to update that. So let me ask you this. Do you have to have a reserve consultant update it every single year? No. The law doesn't say it has to be a reserve consultant. Would you be wise? Would that be, if you have a technically complicated association, would that be a good idea in terms of the building components? You bet. But that is one of the many things that you're going to document as a board of directors satisfying your business judgment rule protection, giving you access to the safe harbor. So unless it's unreasonable, represents an unreasonable hardship for the association, you'll do a reserve study and you will update that based on visual inspection the first year, and then every 3 years based on visual inspection. You'll also update it annually. But again, does that need to be done by a reserve consultant? Jim, what's your experience in that? Are you updating them every year for your associations?
For a lot of clients, we are. I think there's a decision point, or there's a tipping point there if an association is in the lower percent, the high-risk category. If they've had some surprises, these kinds of things, I think will trigger that tipping point. So it's about 50-50, to be honest. I think it's a good idea. I think that part of Switzerland and Safe Harbor is certainly using your team of professionals. The off-site updates are very low cost when compared to the on-site ones. But a lot of associations in Washington are underfunded and older. So for a lot of those associations, it makes good sense.
So who makes the decision anyway on these reserve studies? Is it you or your members? Now, we're a democracy, right? People have fought for this democracy. Shouldn't we get everybody together to decide and we vote on it? I don't think so. It's a decision for the board to make. And so you as the board members get to make this decision about the preparation and updating. You don't put it to a vote of the members to say, folks, what do you think? Should we update this thing this year or not? So understand that there are delegable duties, some things that you could delegate to others, to committees, and there are non-delegable duties. This is a non-delegable duty, the decision. And what do you want to do as to your decision about updating and who's going to update it? You're going to say, we've given reasonable consideration to that. We've spoken to the professionals in the area, and we've decided that we'll update it ourselves, or we'll get a contract, or whoever you're going to use, you're going to leave that trail of breadcrumbs. We're not just left in the dark about what's an unreasonable hardship, because a little bit later, when it comes to challenges, and we're going to talk about that in a second, where an association has not done a reserve study, has not updated, then one of the guidances that we get in the statute is it talks about unless what would represent an unreasonable hardship to the association would be if the cost of this reserve study was 10% or more of the budget. So you have a safe harbor there. One of the things that you could say, because we've just been talking about, the association is encouraged to do this unless it's undue hardship to perform one, we get some guidance from the statute that says, well, it is undue hardship if it's 10% or more of the budget for the association. That would be the cost of this reserve study. But again, is that the rule? Is it just 10%? No. That you use your reasonable business judgment in sorting it out. But know that there's a reference to that. You're going to document hardship, and the reason that you're going to document it is for business judgment rule protection. Can you go to the next slide there, please? So a reserve consultant, independent person, how do you judge? I mean, because statutory, is there licensing for you? Did you qualify? What did you do to become a reserve person?
There's no degree. There's a credentialing program that CAI has. It's a reserve specialist credential. There's another body, the Association of Professional Reserve Analysts, that has a PRA credential. But could anybody hang up a shingle to do reserve studies? They could.
And so, what do you think, board? Billy Bob says he'll do it for $50 and lunch. What do you think? He says, it's a pretty good Reserve Studies, Inc. What are you going to do? You might, in your reasonable business judgment, say, hey, look, Taco Bell's right down this way and our roofs are right up there. So you might point them, but it just doesn't sound like, as a board, it doesn't sound like you're acting like a reasonably prudent board in the circumstances. And so what I would do as a board is I would say, hey, it's time for us to do this annual update. Ken Hare or Jim or anyone else that does these reserve studies, that just check out CAI's directory and say, this is how we went about making the decision. And so long as we've left that trail of breadcrumbs, that's a fantastic way to get access to the protection. And you're just being wise in that sense.
What if a board member would like to do it and has got experience in construction or architecture?
I mean, like, who knows? Who's built a dollhouse? I built one for my kids. I'm pretty good. I got most of the corners right. Could I update the reserves? Because I'll do it for free. I'm not even Taco Bell. Like, I'll just do it. What do you think? What's your instincts tell you? It just sounds too close. It sounds convenient. It seems efficient. But is that how a board of directors for a nonprofit corporation in the state of Washington wants to operate? I don't think we want to do it that way. And so I would say, well, there might be a cheaper or convenient way to do it. You probably want to say, you know what, I just don't like how that plays out. It sounds like there might be a conflict built in there. It sounds like it might be a breach. What do you say?
Well, now the statute says independent. Could a board member be independent of the association? What does the law say about independent and its standard?
That doesn't sound like independence to me. I think the statutory interpretation is that they're not connected or affiliated. Okay. Let's go to the next slide if we can. Okay. No mandate to fund the reserves. Jim's given you some great guidance. These are some great tools to use for satisfying your business judgment rule protection. The fact that you went to a seminar, it's fantastic. That's right down Main Street. So what happened next? I went to a seminar and educated myself about both the law and practice of reserve studies. But check this out. The statute says that there might be stricter requirements in your governing documents than just statute that says, you know, if it's okay with you, we encourage you to do set aside a reserve account. And then we encourage you to do this reserve study unless it's unduly hard. What if your governing documents say you will do a reserve study every year? Then what trumps what? Got a statute that says we encourage you to and you ought to, but you got a governing document that says you will do it every year based on visual inspection. What are you going to do? You're going to do it every year based on a visual inspection, or think with me, be my associate lawyers. What are we going to do? If we don't like that, that doesn't fit. Amend it. Get it out. Right? So part of this idea of governance for the association is knowing, as the evolution of your association progresses, as you go through these wetting and drying cycles, as you find out how the components are functioning, she's going to say, you know, that doesn't fit us. It fit us for a time. It doesn't fit us now. Let's get it out. But don't just ignore it. Don't blow it off and say, well, yeah, whatever. That doesn't work. Do you get business judgment rule protection for whatever? No, you don't. You just say, well, that didn't fit. It wasn't good, so we did this like, that doesn't work. So amend it out, go through your governing documents, and if it doesn't fit, get it out. And be mindful of these provisions that require it. Okay, so what about the board that says, forget, we just ain't doing it. Sue me. So what happens? What can the members do? Sue you. Now, because a bunch of lawyers and professionals and others had input on this, there's a mechanism in place for members holding 20% of the voting rights to bring in action to compel what's called specific performance, like do this thing. You're required to by statute. But interestingly, the way that it works is that while attorney's fees are recoverable, if you go to the next slide, monetary damages are not recoverable. So a group of homeowners could get together and say, you are not in compliance with the statutory framework for doing these reserve studies, visually every 3 years, updated every year, and we require that you do this. A court can require specific performance, or the association's board can give reasonable assurances to the members that we will do this, we will have it in the budget for the next cycle. If there is such a suit, monetary damages are not recoverable. And that's kind of good. Otherwise, could you see these turf wars would break out? People would say, and here's why I've been damaged. Because you didn't have this, then I couldn't sell it, and because of this, and now the piano doesn't work. Can you see how the thing could expand into all these consequential damages? Now, you're not going to be this kind of board because you're the ones that are here and being educated. But I want you to know that that is a right that members of 20% or the more of the voting has. What can be asserted as an affirmative defense? If you do get sued as a board of directors for not doing the reserve study, because in your business judgment, it said it just costs too darn much to have a full reserve study every 3 years. It's just going to cost too much.
Well, they're less than 1%, so that 10% hardship, just so everybody knows, we've never done one anywhere near 10%. And
yeah, what does a typical reserve study cost? I know it would vary.
Good question. It varies, but I'd say if you had to cut an average, it's a full study is $2,000 to $2,500. I think you'd find that as kind of the marketplace averages. Mm-hmm.
So when that action comes by members saying that you should have done one of these things, we disagree with what the board said, one of the things that the statute lays out is that one of your defenses as a board is it would have been an unreasonable hardship, an undue hardship to us. And you're going to pull out your, what are those called? Corporate memory, the minutes, and you're going to say, this is why. And they give you some final guidance, and that's the 10%. They say, and by statutory definition, 10% of the cost of the or if the reserve study is more than 10% of the annual budget, that is.
How about we don't want to know the results of the study? Would that be an unreasonable hardship?
La 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 la, I cannot hear you.
To cover your ears.
So what do you put in the study? What do you put in the study? What are the kinds of information that you need to have? It's the major maintenance, repair, replacement costs, those things of a significant nature. Doesn't this all just mean we need to reasonably disclose to people information for new buyers coming in? They have a right to know what shape the association is in.
In our industry, defines significant as 1% of the annual operating budget. It is at the board's discretion, that reserve funding threshold, but typically you want to make note of that, about 1% of your annual operating budget. So if it's $200,000 budget, 1% is $2,000. So items that and above could be appropriate if they meet the other criteria for reserve funding, less typically in the operating budget, because you don't want to have a resolution every time you go to spend money for small items. That's burdensome.
Isn't this Exhibit A of how you'd go about satisfying business judgment rule protection? Hello, Jim. Hello, Ken. Hello, whoever you'd contact about these reserve studies. What do you think? What do you think? And then you get this information, and are you jotting that down? Yes, because it gives you the basis for your business judgment. So we decided not to do that. 20% of the homeowners get together and say, no, we disagree with you. Undue hardship, this is the basis of our decision. Can we go to the next slide? What if we need to pull money out? Can you get money there? You have all these expenses, and then you've got this big pile of money over here that says reserve account. Don't you just want it? Like, I want it, and I just don't even know. You just got $100 or $200 or $300,000 in there. Can you pull the money out? And the answer is, oh, shall we put it to a vote of the members? Sounds like a really democratic thing to do, shall we? No! What's that called? Non-delegable. You can't delegate it to them. The law says that the members get notice of what the board's going to do. And are you going to have some information about detailing why you're doing what you're doing in the corporate memory? You bet you are. In the minutes, you're going to detail that. You can borrow from the reserves, but you have to have a repayment plan. And the repayment plan has to provide for repayment. It can be a shorter period, but not longer than 24 months. All right? Unless it would prove to be an unreasonable hardship, an undue hardship on the association, then it can be longer. So do you want to document that? Yes. And what I would have is I'd have a person giving me information about a plan, because as you frame the plan, you frame your way out. Okay.
Can we use this one a sec?
Yeah, go.
So what goes, here's the National Reserve Study Standards in place since 1995, I believe, and the criteria for reserve components. It has to be a common area. Does that mean limited common? No. Is limited common still a common element?
Yes.
Yes. So there may be provisions in your declaration that talks about how expenses for limited common are handled, but limited common is part of the common elements. So you need to look deeper. Is it have a limited useful life? Is it have a predictable life limit? And then cost must be significant. We just talked about that 1% is significant. So that's the 4 in National Reserve Study Standards. Okay, next.
So where do we jump the tracks most often? Number one is you come up with an idea. We say, oh, okay, so this is what we're going to do. But you haven't referred back to your governing documents. And on the big issues, you might think about including somebody else. You might include, whether if it's an accounting issue, a CPA, if it's a legal issue, a lawyer. It's worth a quick call. There are so many attorneys that are knowledgeable and would be happy to field that call and give you some guidance. But don't just make it seem later that you just said, well, whatever, and you threw the dart, because whatever doesn't work. It doesn't give us business judgment rule protection. So adopting a policy that might be inconsistent with your governing documents is a common mistake. Another one is not keeping up with these assessments. You don't need to know that. That's the pressure. That's where you live, is saying, like, how do we find that sweet spot in the assessments and at the same time keep up with inflation? And as Jim was saying later, making these decisions based on emotion rather than fact. Let's go to the next slide if we could. So where are we going to disclose this information about a reserve study? Well, in the public offering statement, to begin with, if it's new construction. In resale certificates. What's up with resale certificates anyway? Do we have to do those? Like often? Or is that just like if you want, unless it poses an unreasonable burden on you, then do one? No, it's mandatory. And so think of resale certificates, and it's all laid out, all the boxes, all the areas of inquiry. If you have a question on that, what do we want to do to get to safe harbor in business judgment rule protection? You're going to call a lawyer, a consultant, somebody to say, hey, what would be the appropriate response to this? Does it say, if you're used to say you'd have to disclose in a resale certificate if you were a defendant in a lawsuit, or if you were rather a plaintiff in a lawsuit. Now it says if you're a plaintiff or a defendant. You want to know like how to appropriately respond to these. What if you're in arbitration? Does that mean, well, it's not a lawsuit, but it's an arbitration? So some of the things that might be those gray areas in between the stars, call a lawyer, call a consultant in that area so that you have a basis. And tell us something about the LAC. What have you been talking about? You hinted at it. Tell us what the LAC's been up to and what you see in the tea leaves.
Well, the tea leaves, I like that. 2008 was when the law went into place, and we've got a lot of good feedback since that time. And this is one of the key areas, and it's kind of a no-brainer who you disclose the studies to. There wasn't a provision in there to disclose it to all of the owners. So one of the things proposed for 2011 session will be to make that part of the budget. Part of the budget ratification process is that the substantiation behind that reserve contribution is there. There is some cleanup work in the borrowing provision to make that more clear, the intent of that, that Bob talked about a little bit ago. What else? I think a lot of it was language stuff, because all in all, it seems to be working well. The model is about disclosure, as Bob said. It's really about communicating. And when everybody knows what you're facing together, you have a much better chance of success. So those are just the key areas. It didn't need a lot of tweaking. There was a lot of good minds and stakeholders that put that law together. Guys like Brian McLean and John Coe and others. Pretty well thought out. I think it's working well.
You're going to find some great statutory language, and some of it is in your materials for the resale certificate. If you decide that it's going to pose an undue hardship for the association to do an updated reserve study, this is what the statute says you're supposed to say. And this would be the quick call to the lawyer. Say, well, we decided in our business judgment not to do this, using those terms, and the lawyers can say, is that in your minutes? If they're worth their salt, say, is that in your minutes? Yes, it is. Then that lawyer, he or she will tell you, then you need to use this language right out of the statute. This association does not have a current reserve study. The lack of a current reserve study poses certain risks to you. Kind of sounds like the pack of cigarettes. At the purchaser, insufficient reserves may, under some circumstances, require you to pay on demand a special assessment, your share of common expenses for the major costs of maintenance, repair, replacement of a common element. So there's guidance in the statutes about if you decide not to do a reserve study, what it is that you would have to say. So why is it that we're looking at these essential components? I mean, what is it that is causing all the fuss? What caused all this to come into place in the first place?
Well, I think it was maybe not the best planning from the outset into how insufficient reserves would affect long term. I think many times there seems to be a mindset that you're going to live in a place for a certain period of time. I think the average, last I checked, was about 7 years, and people don't want to look out 10, 20 years down the road. So the first condominium in King County was in 1964. Coolest name ever. It's called El Condo. I love that, El Condo. And well, what we've learned since that time is, human nature comes into play. And I think it comes down to, I mentioned earlier about involvements on board. The most successful clients we have are those that have strong committee structures, and we have some co-housing association clients that they have shared their meals together. It's kind of a hippie commune kind of thing. I love it. And they're the most functional clients that we have because they all have a job. They all work together. So many times what's happened is that you've got the boards and the owners, and they're separate. And therefore, the communication was lacking. And that's all this is about now. If you disclose this stuff together, then it's a much lower risk that you're going to get to those big expenses to where people don't know about them. And people don't like big surprises like that, the surprise of writing the big check. So planning, greater disclosure and planning guidance through the reserve studies has helped increase awareness. And now I think you're seeing in the private sector, lenders have become increasingly aware of the importance of this. Hence the policy by FHA requiring not only reserve accounts but mandated funding levels for a period of time. And you would want to, wouldn't you think, if you made a loan, you would want to make sure it's financially viable. So those things over time, I think, is just a natural evolution, Bob, just better planning and better disclosures. But at the get-go, condos were pretty new. Historically, you look around the globe, condos are a very young form of ownership.
And you know what you need to be is a bit of, you need to be Greenspan a little bit. You need to say, if we pass the special assessment, and Jim and others like him will give you guidance, if we end up with a special assessment, how many people aren't going to be able to pay that? Therefore, how many of these units are going to be foreclosed on? And then, do banks make great neighbors? No, they're lousy neighbors. And so one of the things you're going to want to think about is, what's that sweet spot? What can people do? And part of the whole idea of reserve studies and disclosures in advance is to let people know that you can't later say, I'm not paying the special assessment because you didn't tell me. Either were material facts you should have said. Hence the disclosure to say we don't have a current one. Better practice, just have one. And you're going to take a hit, and it's going to cost a couple bucks, but that's not a punishing expense compared to advising and updating that many homeowners about what's going on. Let's go to the next slide. So potentially in this reserve study, you come up with issues. Like what if it says, well, Jim has been accurate and careful to say what a reserve study is not. It is not a full forensic investigation. But what if in the reserve study it says, we were up on the roofs and we just stepped through them? What if you find, there's some big deals? Let me ask you this. There's two safe harbors that I want to additionally add to my list. One of them is called attorney work product. This is the way it works. If any of the information developed in contemplation of litigation is part of the attorney's work product, then you get to assert certain protections and privileges over that. Might it be if you spoke to a reserve analyst and they said, we're seeing some stuff here that we think that there's some major problems brewing. Might you use that as a work product document? Include counsel in that. The work product doctrine says this: if a report from a consultant is developed and it comes through counsel, it's not discoverable by the other side. Now, these documents need to be produced to the homeowners. They need to be produced to others. There are holes in that theory, but wouldn't you want to, as a matter of first alert, include counsel? Because among other things, there might be attorney-client communications. There might be input, things that you'll get for your minutes. Now, let me ask you this. Are you going to write in your minutes what the lawyer told you? No, because you are the holder of the privilege, and if you start writing down what the lawyer said, then you've lost that privilege. But might you want, when one of the reserve consultants come back and says, gosh, we're seeing big stuff here that's awry, might you want to include a lawyer right away? Probably, for purposes of just consulting. Now, do you all know what the statute of limitations is for bringing an action if there were problems that were identified in the reserve study? Well, it's not a forensic tool. It's one of the first alerts. What's the statute of limitations? You get 4 years from the first sale date. So here's my homework assignment for you. Know where you are. I walk into a big shopping mall with Sweet Maria Goff, and there's a sign in it that says, you are here. And I kind of get it. Like, I know where I am. Find out what the first sale date for the first unit and the first phase was. And then add 4 years to that. If you're at 5 years, don't panic. Call an attorney. Call somebody knowledgeable and say, what do we do to protect our rights? Does that make sense? That's just being proactive and saying, how do I then deal with that information? Not in the corporate minutes, but you would retire, for instance, to executive session to talk about those items. A responsibility matrix. Tell us. I've read that handout. It's fantastic.
Good, good, good. Everybody, if you'll refer to that, one of the documents, the first one that was handed out to you when you come in, it says, Schedule D, Maintenance Responsibility Chart. How many of you can look at this and say your association has something like this, where it tells you what you're responsible for? Wow. One hand in the back. This is another one. That's because this is yours. White it out. So this is key. I think every association needs to have a document like this. And I've seen them in different forms. Unfortunately, it's the exception and not the rule. Governing documents, and everybody should know what governing documents are. It's your declaration of condominium, your articles of incorporation, your rules and regulations, your bylaws, the plat map. Plat, I think that's a governing document. Does that cover them all, Bob?
Yes.
I think that covers them. So there's a lot to understand there, and this is why you need professionals. An attorney is invaluable in this regard, and there's some very good ones here today. But what I like about this one as you go through it is it gives you several column headings: clean, maintain, repair, replace, paint, resurface, repave. That's a lot of different terms, and a real clear O, owner, A, association. This would save us as reserve study providers a ton of headache, because many times we're the first ones in, and we have to put on a quasi-attorney hat, which we don't like to do, but it's our job is to do. Remember we said that 4-part criteria, is it a common element? Well, you have to understand a bit about governing documents to make that determination in the first place. So if you have something like this, it will save you and the community so much grief. So I don't imagine that it's a very expensive document to do with your attorney, but get a responsibility matrix put together. I think it's very important. And maintenance, repair, replacement, we saw paint, We saw, what else was on there? Clean. So they're distinct terms. And lawyers tend to be very literal, don't they?
Yes.
Yes. So what do you look for when reviewing your governing documents? And I want Bob to work with me a bit on here. These were my bullet points, and this is into the area that's outside of my comfort zone. And one thing I think is you should find all of the musts, the shalls, and the may, and they have different meanings.
Yes,
Okay.
agreed. And then wouldn't you want to have, before we're going to do this, just echoing what Jim said, some of these things might represent a huge shifting of responsibility. So you don't want to just say, well, we've got that, you've got that, you've got that. So the importance of having counsel involved in making that determination based on your declarations. And if you disagree with it, if there's an ambiguity, and I promise you there will be if you're going through the declarations, what do you have the ability to do? What's built right into the declarations to do? Change them. So it might be a good time as an overall tune-up to just say, let's bring these things into harmony. And some shalls, if it's supposed to be a maybe, or if a maybe is supposed to be a shall, this is a great time to do that and tease out responsibilities.
Very good. As we went earlier and we spoke about what the statute says encouraged, and it said many governing documents go further to say, and there's really a couple of attorneys in my experience, and we've read hundreds and hundreds of documents over the years, if not thousands. Most often it says the association shall create reserves, and then you see wording significant to pay for major maintenance, repair, and replacement when it occurs. Now, if the declaration trumps the act there, then that's something to be well aware of. So really know that provision, because most of them in our experience does say it shall create, and I've seen shall fund. One of the attorneys who writes many of these puts in that language. Of course, getting to know the common and limited common elements is very key, because they can be treated separately, can't they, in how they're paid for and cared for.
Let me talk to you just for a brief moment about waiver. One of the defenses that is raised oftentimes by a homeowner when you're saying you need to do this, they're going to say, well, but wait a second, look at the last 9 times that's occurred. If it's an architectural control committee, you say you need to take down the hot pink drapes. You say, well, wait a second, there's, chartreuse is over there, and all that. So issues of waiver will become important. So how you deal with limited common area issues becomes important. You're setting, it has precedential value, and I just need you to know, as you're making your decision, it's not that one size fits all, like, no, we can't make that decision because it'll set this precedent. You're just mindful of that, and you might even surround that with some. This is an exception because, and then so anticipating arguments that somebody would say, you've waived your right as a board to assert that position in the future, you could say, we're grandfathering this one, and as soon as there's a change in ownership, that's out. Does that make sense? That's being strategic about this.
Yes, excellent point. We've seen that many times where we've had clients that are 20, 25 years old, and they have assigned a deck coating responsibility to the owners, only to find really that it should have been the association responsibility, but they had those years of precedent. So that is considered in the courts. So what we're going to do now, something I'm really looking forward to, we've got a half hour left, we can get through this and leave some time for your questions as well. That'd be great. But what I want to do is look at that second packet that we handed out, and it's half a dozen pages from an actual declaration. And you're going to watch me kind of stumble through trying to find out who is responsible for a couple key elements. So to set this up, this association, this hypothetical one, was built in 1995. And we're going to look at 2 key things. We're going to look at decks and windows. Two items that we found are kind of difficult sometimes to understand who the responsibility falls to. And specifically, these types of decks are a liquid applied surface. They're a closed cavity deck, and they have a traffic coating that's rolled on, a urethane type coating. A lot of Seattle has these types of decks. And windows. And before I get going, 80 to 85% of most of your association financial needs in the long term are going to come down to a half a dozen items I call the big 6. Be aware of these: painting, siding, roofing, asphalt, windows, decks. Those 6 things will far and away drive the financial needs of most associations over time. So if you pull this. Can you repeat those 6? Yes. I hope I can remember them now. Painting, siding, roofing, asphalt, windows, decks. The big six. So if you pull this document open.
Can I just chime in for a second?
Sure.
One of the issues will be ambiguity of these documents. Can you go to the previous? Sure. Oh, no, this is the right one. Yeah. Under shutters, etc., we're going to be talking about windows and railings and balconies. It's real easy you're looking for the window section and you don't find it, but it's buried in there, and it says here that it's a limited common element. And we're going to go a little bit further and see how it's defined elsewhere.
Right. And you'll see that in several places. So a key point, too, before we get too much further into this, is realize that there's other pieces to the puzzle rather than these 6 pages. There's this huge, the governing documents, there's a huge body of text in the bylaws. Could they say something about how elements are cared for? Rules and regs, could they say something? Absolutely. So you've got to look at all of these in totality, but this is just an idea of some of the language in a typical declaration. So we're going to look for windows and decks, and one of the things that we start with, if we boil a condominium, and we're talking about a condominium, down to its simple form, we have the unit, which is typically defined as interior surfaces, paint, and then everything outside of that is common elements. That at its most simplest is what it is, and you're fractional owners in this real estate holding. And so if you look at the unit boundaries, the first thing, when I'm looking at windows and decks, now it says interior surfaces of perimeter walls, floors, and ceilings are the boundaries. Decorative and finished surface coverings, including paint, wallpaper, paneling, are a part of the unit. All other portions of the walls, floors, and ceilings are a part of the common elements. Okay? So there's no mention of windows right here. I have seen unit boundaries defined as the interior surface, and it lists windows there. Okay, so interior surface of the windows. What is a window? Does anybody have a window defined for me? What is it? There's 3 essential pieces to a window. There's the frame, the sash, the operable portion, and the insulated glass unit. So one of the things I think that we could all better understand and perhaps spell out in our governing documents and policies are knowing the 3 different things, because there's an area that trips a lot of people up. Is the owner may be responsible in some cases to replace just the glass if it breaks, or a seal unit, but the frame and the waterproof and the stuff that keeps your building inside dry may be very well associations, but and they're written differently many times. So okay, so no mention of windows or decks at that one. So here's the interior, we got a unit. Okay, good, we're getting somewhere. So then this 4.14, still under unit boundaries, shutters, etc. Any shutters, awnings, window boxes, door steps, stoops. How many of you have stoops? Okay. We got stoops, we got porches, we got balconies, patios, kind of all-inclusive, railings, and all exterior doors and windows, or other, are limited common. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. We see that limited common elements, windows are a limited common element. Now what about the decks? I saw door steps, stoops, porches, balconies. Reasonable to assume deck is a synonym for a stoop or a porch or a balcony? I think so. So I think right now we can say that decks and windows are limited common. How am I doing so far?
Good.
Okay, good. Okay. So then we get into a little further in the common elements, Article 6, description of common elements, except as otherwise specifically allocated by the previous section, which we just went through. Article 7, okay, there's another place we got to look, or other provisions of this declaration, some other places we may have to look. Common elements consist of all portions except units and include the following. And you can see in 6.2, roofs or windows, in fact, are listed as the top of the very first one, roofs, foundations, columns, girders, on and on. So good. So then it talked windows is a common element. Okay, so common or limited common. So again, limited common is still a common element. It just means it's limited to the use of that particular owner. So then we get into a little further, and now we're talking about just the common elements. And it says in 7.1.1, the patio yard area, and here's deck. Finally we get deck. It's not stoops or porches here. We had, or lanai, now we got a new one. Okay, how many have a lanai? I don't know. I think they call that in Hawaii, right? Is that a lanai? So Now decks, in addition to window, just further support that they are limited common elements. So good, we're moving on, we're getting somewhere. Now in section 10, next page of the declaration is a board authority. What is the board authorized to do, and they're charged to enhance, maintain, and protect the assets of the association? So if you look at sub R there, is that what that is? Maintain and repair any unit, its appurtenances and appliances, and any limited common elements, if such maintenance or repair is reasonably necessary in the discretion of the board to protect the common elements or preserve the appearance and value of the condominium. What does that mean? You want to take a stab of what that section means?
I think it makes everything. Can you see the inconsistency? So at the beginning of the declarations, we're saying windows are limited common areas. They are part of the unit. Then in the next page, it's saying it's a common element. In other words, it's not part of the unit. It's a common element. And now we have a section that says the board in its discretion can kind of decide what that needs to do to preserve the entire association. Can you see how squishy that becomes when we talk about these issues of waiver and the board's practice? If you decide to do this, following this rabbit trail, you could end up waiving claims for your next one. So I guess this would be an example when it comes to the board's discretion and some of its thought process about how it's going to deal with these various elements, whether they're limited common elements or common elements. I would involve, when they're the touchy issues, those ones that raise a flag for you, involve counsel to tease out, because what we want to do is harmonize all the declarations, all the governing documents. You don't want rules and regulations that conflict with declarations or declarations that internally conflict. Okay. And how do we fix it? An amendment.
Amendment, okay. Does this section imply that the board has a duty to protect the common elements? I think it said it pretty clearly, right? So let's think about those decks and windows. Has anybody gone through major reconstruction of their condominiums? Condominium, okay, a bit in here. One of the most common areas of water intrusion, two of the most common areas, are windows and decks. Absolutely right up there on top of the list. And so their installation and waterproofing details are very important. So now that we see that this limited common elements are looking like owner responsibility, but the board has kind of a duty, this at least reasonable care, and it says that they have the authority then to come in and make repairs and replacements, okay? So it is a little bit of a head scratcher right here. And so let's keep reading. And then I've circled the word and. It says limited common, if such maintenance and repair is reasonably necessary in the discretion of the board to protect the common elements, to preserve the appearance and value. Boy, that's a big charge, preserve the value. And the owner of said unit has failed or refused to perform said maintenance or repair within a reasonable time after written notice, okay? These are key for you guys to find these types of provisions and really understand what they mean. And rather for me flounder any further, the importance of counsel. Understand exactly what these means, and if you don't like that, make sure you've done it through an amendment and put it on this responsibility matrix, okay? In general, my bias is that the association should be responsible for those elements collectively that keep water out of the building. Best chance of success. I've just seen it way too often if owners are left to recoat their decks, and many times that deck coating we talked about, that urethane, looks absolutely fine, but there may be imperceptible pinholes that allow water to come in there, and a wood substructure gets rotted away, and that $500 to $600 deck coating turns into $5,000 to $10,000 repair replacement. So that's the idea, is being smart about and proactive about these types of things. So going on further, and I think this is under this section of, I should have written it down, limited common maintenance, or whatever section 11 is here. 11.6 says, limited common elements as defined in Article 7 for the sole and exclusive use of the units which they're reserved or assigned, provided that the use and condition and appearance thereof may be regulated under provisions of the bylaws, rules, or this declaration. So there's pointing you towards some of those other governing documents too, like we talked about, rules and bylaws. Now how about the hierarchical chain there. Which trumps the bylaws, the rules, the declaration?
Yeah, so here's the hierarchy. This would be Civics 101. It would be the United States Constitution. If there's something that's constitutional, that trumps everything. Under that, think of state constitution. Under that, think of state laws. Underneath that, think of governing documents. First, the Articles of Incorporation to say you're a nonprofit corporation for this reason. Yours won't be a factor because it just say do all things lawful. Under that, the declarations, they are the law. Under that, what are the bylaws? It's the how-to. It's about notice, it's about how many board members. Think of that as the procedure for how we get there. And then pulling up the bottom of the cart is rules and regulations. So you could say, I have a rule or regulation, but if that conflicts with anything upstream, if it conflicts with the declarations or city law or state law or constitutional issue, then that trumps.
So if you want to, again, change responsibility or clarify, don't just do it in the rules or don't just pass a board resolution. Here's who's responsible. Make it official. Hold that question, please, Jennifer. We're going to try and leave a few minutes for questions. So we go on to say 11.6.1, decisions by board. Decisions with respect to the standard of appearance and condition of limited common elements and with respect to the necessity for and the manner of caring for, maintaining, repairing, repainting, or redecorating. So there's 4 different terms right there. Limited common elements, and then they refer to that as the definition of maintenance work shall be made by the board. So the board is setting a standard of care. It's very important to know. Now I've underlined maintaining and repairing. I didn't see replace. Is that potentially have a separate meaning, replace?
What about that? Anybody seen in your declarations where it talks about replacing or an addition, an improvement that costs over sometimes $25,000? Is that familiar for some of you? What if you decide that you're going to change out your wood shake roof for a ceramic tile or some other kind of fake shake that's new and cutting edge? What if you do that? Is that repair and replacement or is that an improvement? One of the things that you're going to want to pause to consider is if it's a different material, is that an improvement under your declarations that would require, what does that require? A vote, because what Jim has appropriately directed you to is maintenance and repair. Those are board decisions. Is that delegable? Associate attorneys. No, it's non-delegable. It's yours. It's right there. However, when it comes to an improvement, that requires a vote of the membership. And so a heads up on that, when you say, well, let's just replace it with this, be heads up to say, is that possible that it could be construed as an improvement that required a vote? Because what would happen, let's play it out for a second. Homeowner gets a $5,000 special assessment for that, and they say, I ain't paying. What are they going to say? It was an improvement. It required a vote. You don't have a vote. You've already let the contract to the general contractor. You have a legal duty. Quite a few associations have found themselves wrapped around the axle in that, where homeowners say, I'm not paying the special assessment. You've already committed the association to a contractor.
Good. And let's talk a little bit further about those decks that we talked about. They need a top coating every 5 or so years. That's real typical of that type of deck. That is a maintenance activity. Painting is a maintenance activity. So that's something that needs to be done to keep the water out. So that's something to keep in mind. So going on a little further, 11.6.4, owner pays cost. Okay, this might tell us a little bit more. Unit owners will be responsible for the cost of such maintenance work, which we just saw in 11.6.1 means maintaining, repairing, repainting, or redecorating. Again, doesn't say replacement. And those decisions shall be made by the board. And it says for the limited common elements reserved for or assigned to their units. So they'll be responsible for the cost of it. Okay. Let's go on to the next page. And we're going to look at 12.5. And there's something, there's a section, one section I missed I want to talk about. There, in limited common elements in this declaration, it actually gave the boundaries of the limited common element as well. And it talked about, like in the unit, it talked about surfaces, okay? And so like on those decks, a surface, that traffic coating is a surface, okay? So that's important to know, I think, too, in the context of this, is that the boundaries can be defined of the limited common element. So 12.5, limited common element, any common expense associated with the operation, maintenance, and now it throws in replacement in this one. Repair or replacement of a limited common element shall be paid by the owner of or assessed against the units to which that limited common element is assigned equally. Now I'm going to admit in front of you, I don't understand this one at all. So if we could break this down, so a common expense associated with operation, maintenance, repair, or replacement, which is covers most things that you would do to a limited common element, shall be paid by the owner, okay, I get that, or assessed against the units. Now let's stop there. Does that mean a special assessment? Does that mean monthly assessments you collect, correct? That's a form of assessment. So could you collect, does that imply that you could collect it through reserves, assessed? Is that one way assessment, or is special assessment?
Could do it through reserves, but oftentimes when you have a limited common area, in other words, one that's just set aside for Mr. Jones' unit, if there's a maintenance responsibility there, or a new top coating or something attributable to where he had his pots or his toaster or whatever he had outside, that would be theirs. And the cost of maintaining and repairing that limited common area would be theirs. And so my view would be that he might get a $400 bill for recoating that portion of his limited common area deck.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And equally, it says to which that limited common element is assigned equally. What if you have different size decks? What if some have a deck, the ground floor has patios that don't have a coating? And how's that handled?
And it really should be done proportionately. What you're going to try to do, can you see how that creates some ambiguity? It would be better to say on a percentage basis or for those units that, but part of this would be illustrative of this idea of precedential value. They would say, what happened? First question anybody's going to ask is, what happened last time we did it? And if it comes across as like, we don't know, we just kind of did it, then you have something bollocks up. What are we going to do to tidy up a big expense, a big potential expense, before we incur that expense? A cleanup amendment. Let's just tidy that up. Everyone votes. That provision is built in. So if your declarations are foggy, and they will be on some issues, you'll decide, are we going to amend every time there's a foggy issue? No, you'll always be amending. But just a general cleanup for big events in the association's life, it might be good to forecast that and say, if our declarations are ambiguous on that, why don't we put this up for a vote in terms of an amendment of the declarations?
Okay, very good. So hopefully the takeaway that you're getting here is that there's a lot to this. From my perspective, I really implore you not only to have written policies, but really consider, because there is a duty for the board to maintain, protect, and enhance, really consider the carefully of those items that could potentially cause damage to the association. Remember those big six. Remember here today that decks and windows are key area of waterproofing details. You want them inspected regularly cared for. So I think best practices, responsibility matrix you can leave here, keeping an eye on this reserve study years ago, and this is what I love that's evolved about this industry, is it's looked at each year as it should be. It's a significant portion of the budget. So look at it each year, understand what your responsibilities are, understand the definitions, work with your attorney closely to define these items, and have written solid plans. And I think with that, I'd love to open it up for questions. You want to try and take a few questions?
Why don't we just take them from like this side to that?
Okay. Yeah, the gentleman's point, and it was a good one, is sometimes you can't assume that the reserve study's accuracy on those items that particularly have hidden aspects to them. And that's why another client model of ours that's very successful are those that have a roof consultant every year. That you got to realize that there is no one expert. As much as we would like to have one-stop shopping, you need a subset of experts: building envelope people, roof consultants, the great painters, specialty sealants. You know, caulking, which is a verb, is a very key area. And when the better information, what the reserve study does is it gives you this framework. That's what we're expert at, and then you refine it further to where you really understand how that building's put together and the things that can affect the life of that. Is there someplace that shows the formula for that? Yes, there is. It's in the software that we use. Next question. And we actually, our company provides that with the final report, so you could look at that to your heart's content. But at its basic element is really that fractionalized deterioration. You look at the cost now, you figure inflation, it's going to go up. Typically, you use 3% per year. If it's every 10 years, it's 1/10 of that item. If it's every 5 years, it's 1/5. It's pretty elemental, but it gets more complex, doesn't it, when you spread it over time and you're talking inflation and interest too, because you get money coming in and out, and that's why we love the computer. If the glass breaks from the landscape or a rock gets thrown, or Timmy throws a ball through it, or it's got a seal failure, the answer is in your declaration. Is it the same answer for every association? No.
Let me piggyback on that. It would be, everybody hear the question, who's responsible for the glass? Part of it would be causation. You have a glass that's broken. If it broke because of Johnny's baseball, that's a different result than if the building was racking because of a structural issue, and the racking of the building racked the frame and popped the ICU units. Right. Can we just say in the declarations, see rules and regulations? What's kind of neat about it, you don't have to do that. The declarations already come equipped with that. It says, see rules and regulations. But do you want to deal with an issue, a major component of the building in a